And you're going to learn from the success and failure in these two, and you're going to learn how the logic of a successful guy lead him to winning the case, and how should those sort of logics be applied to the case that is going to fail. Before you start, this is just another reminder to take care of your health and make sure you're healthy and safe. Try to cover your cough, wash your hands, stay home when you're sick, and try to prevent touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. And then we've got disclosure about the materials that are coming from 4 different places for this particular lecture. One thing to be clear, I'm gonna try to finish this lecture in one session today, but there's a good chance that we can. If that happens, then we will continue on Monday. Otherwise, we're going to use the Monday and Wednesday next week for working on your final homework assignment and the final report, sorry, final project. I'm going to talk about that at the end of the session. So this announcement is about ACM student outreach. If you're interested, please send me an email. This other announcement is about this study that we're running currently. And we are looking for individuals above 18 years old who have at least 6 months of experience in C and C++ programming languages. Some of you already volunteered. And if you do, you should have received an email from our team about the scheduling. And you should have an idea about the available time slots that we've got during the week. If you haven't, if you already sent us an email and requested to participate, but you haven't received an email back about the scheduling from us yet, please send me an email ASAP, and I will make sure that your time slots are saved. If the study is about looking at the brain activities during the translation of code, then we are trying to understand what the code is doing. And it's going to give us some insights about how the brain handles the sophisticated process of understanding the logic of a code snippet. We're going to use electroencephalogram to look at the brain activities. We're going to use eye tracking to look at the eye movements and how you parse information in front of you. And we're going to use multiple picture cameras to make sure that we capture any body movements that you might have. And this is a 2-session studies, and we will receive 45 sessions to compensate you for your time. And if you are interested, please send me either me or Professor Jean an email, and we're going to put you in contact with our team to do the scheduling and arrange for your sessions. Is there any questions? No questions? All right. So we want to talk about information visualization. And there are 3 very important components that come involved in mind, which is why, what, and how. So when we reason about quantitative evidence, certain methods for displaying and analyzing data are going to be considered as a better method than some others. But superior methods are more likely to produce truthful, credible, and precise findings. The difference between an excellent analysis and a faulty one can sometimes have some momentous consequences, and we're going to see how this comes to play in our today's lecture. Let's start with some example, if I can find the mouse. Okay. So here's a couple of questions. Is a visualization a better representation of data than a table? And if you're like someone like me, and kind of love doing charts, then the answer is probably a yes. But the question is there an actual way to show this and prove this? So it's an interesting statement that probably true, and it's probably true that the graphs are rough when it comes to showing exact value for each individual point. But sometimes it's not the individual value that are of interest to us, and instead of that, we kind of want to know what the entire data set basically shows together rather than a single point. So let's have a look at this particular data set that we've got in here. So as you can see, it's divided into 4 groups, where each group has 11 points with x and a y value. From a glance at the different groups, it seems like the last group is the easiest to understand. But it would be hard to say how those 4 groups basically are different from each other. We could try to look at the characteristics of these groups by looking at their statistical properties. And for those groups, they have basically the same or very similar properties when you do a statistical analysis. So this is where this data set really succeeds in showing out that despite being 4 different groups, they have the same properties, and it's therefore hard to basically describe them just by using some statistical measures. So now what we want to do is have a look at the visual representation and see if we can basically be more easily describing them. If you look at the first group on the left-hand side, is it just me or PowerPoint stopped working on? Oh, it's probably I didn't allow it to be editable. That's why. It doesn't let me to use the marker. It's just giving me the pointer. Okay, anyhow. So if you look at the first group in this picture that you see in the left-hand side, the group seems to have some sort of a linear relationship within this data. If you look at the data in the second group, it also has some sort of a relationship between x and y, but obviously this is no longer a linear relationship. If you look at the third group, this also has some sort of a linear relationship, similar to the first group, except that this one has it's much tighter with the outlier, the top being the odd one here. Now, the very last group that we've got is the one that is very different from everything else that we've got in here. But the thing is, it has an outlier up here, and that outlier makes the statistical probability behave like the first and the second one. So in this case, we do prove that that just looking at the table of data gives some sort of less value than doing a visualization of it. But what you can basically also agree that there are cases where a data representation is probably easier to understand than a visualization, such as something like, for example, a profit loss table. So there are places that the graphical representation is going to be better in most cases, but then there are some rare cases that the other one is going to be more informative. So we've got this famous passage from Stuart Carr, who said that visualization is really about external cognition. That is, how resources outside the mind can be used to boost the cognitive capabilities of the mind. Now, with that being said, now I'm going to look at 2 examples. And and see how do you feel about this visualization. Uh, so take a look at this. What do you really see here? So all the different components in this scene will just stand against each other. They are obviously color coded, and based on the color coding, it's simple. They are in three different groups. We have infectious diseases, we have injuries, and non-communicable diseases. So what is the relationship uh, between these? Exactly by looking at this, can you actually say what is the, for example, cause of these diseases and how they are related to each other? For example, can you say what is the relationship between TB and stroke and suicide? This is TB, this is suicide, this one is stroke.
Compare the sizes of the percentages of the block itself, so they might not be related to
Sorry?
the different blocks, each of the different color schemes. They might be completely separate on a different scale than the other block, but just enlarged to fit this dimension.
Okay. Anybody else?
Isn't there some things where like your eyes can play tricks on you and how big certain things are? So you could think that something looks much bigger than it actually is, but if you compare them like the same space, they're actually the exact same
So
size.
which two are you referring to?
Um, not really anyone in particular, but TB and suicide, you can't really put them next to each other enough, so they kind of look like maybe suicide's half, but you can't be certain about that. I don't know. If that's-
So let's consider two different things. The first thing, would you consider a graphic like this misleading, or do you consider it as informative? You think it's misleading? What about the rest of you?
I mean, I personally think it's informative at a glance, getting exact numbers, getting exact numbers out of this, but just wanting to know the data on the surface level, you get information out of it.
Okay.
I think it's a bit misleading because there's just blocks that aren't labeled, so you don't know what those are supposed to be.
So, yeah,
I think it's misleading.
think it's misleading.
I think it's informative if you're just kind of, I don't know, on your phone, you scroll past it, you look at it. It's something that for like a couple seconds, like, oh, interesting, and then you keep moving it. But anything deeper past giving it a quick glance, I think it's a little misleading.
Okay. Let's look at another representation of the same data. Let's see what you think about that. So in here we have the number of deaths per 100,000 in 2010. We have the percentage of the life lost between years 2005 and 2010. And then we have years of life lost per 100,000 in 2010. And the legends are presented in top here on left. And there are three groups of communicable, non-communicable, and injuries again. This is essentially the same set of data presented in here, but now you have a somewhat of a better chance in understanding the relationship between various diseases being presented, and we have a better chance to map one of these bars to something of an actual number compared to what we had before in here. So what do you think about this one?
I would say this is more informative. There's more labels, there's more meaning, you can see trends, with numbers associated with each of the process of loss as well.
So we talked about data integrity or graphical integrity before. Do you remember? There were some examples about graphics based on perspectives. This is one of those. Now we have three sets of data, three groups on three different scales, right? Presented in the same way. Now, here is one question. Can I say the relationship between drowning and road accidents in here are in the same level between, for example, what is this theory?
Type
Between this one and, for example, TB? Or between a stroke and what is this one? Neurological. Are they the same? So the color coding is used in here based on what you see in the other graph, represents the intensity in some degree, but intensity in different scales. So being dark or light in there, the degree of darkness or lightness in, for example, the green category has nothing to do with the degree of darkness and lightness in the yellow or purple. Is that purple or pink? In the pink category, for example, or let's call it red. How do I know this? Here it is. Look it up here. This is in the scale of 0 to 3000. This is in a scale of minus 30% to 30%, and this one is in a scale of 0 to 125. So the amount of difference between these two in this category has nothing to do with the amount of difference between these two in this category. Okay. So let's talk about information visualization. So visualizations basically enable people to explore, analyze, and understand information that is hidden in the data. So the questions that you often ask yourself is that how can we determine which method for displaying data are going to be better than others, and what does the better really mean? So in this lecture, we are going to examine the statistical and graphical reasoning used in making two life and death decisions. The first case scenario is going to be how to stop the cholera epidemic in London during September 1854, and whether to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger on January 20th, 1986. So by creating statistical graphics that reviewed the data, Dr. John Snow was able to discover the cause of epidemic and bring it to an end. We are going to argue against bringing it to an end later on, but let's say for now, let's get a naive thing and a naive approach and say he brought it to an end. Now, we can contrast that with the Challenger case, where by fooling around with displays that obscure the data, those who decided to launch the space shuttle got it wrong, and it was terribly wrong. And for both of these cases, the consequences resulted directly from the quality of methods used in displaying and assessing quantitative evidence. Before we get to that, let's take a look at what Professor Top said about visual in his book called Visual and Statistical Thinking, Displays of Evidence for Making Decisions. He said, when we reason about quantitative evidence, certain methods for displaying and analyzing data are better than others. Superior methods are more likely to produce truthful, credible, and precise findings. And the difference between an excellent analysis and a faulty one can sometimes have momentous consequences. And poor displays often lead to invalid arguments and false conclusions, and good displays lead to valid arguments and true conclusions. Now let's start with our first case scenario. Our first case scenario is about Dr. John Snow, who intervenes in one chloride. So in classical medical detective work on the mode of communication of corona, Dr. Snow described with some precise language of evidence, numbers and comparison, the severity of the pandemic. This is what it said. It says the most terrible outbreak of cholera which ever occurred in this kingdom is probably that which took place in Broad Street, Golden Square, adjoining the streets a few weeks ago. Within 250 yards of the spot where Cambridge Street joins Broad Street, there were upwards of 500 fatal attacks of cholera in 10 days. The mortality in this limited area probably equals any that was ever caused in the country, even by the plague. And it was much more sudden, the greater number of cases terminated in a few hours. The mortality would undoubtedly have been much greater had it not been for the flight of the population. Persons in furnished lodgings left first, then other lodgers went away, leaving their furniture to be sent for, and many houses were closed, altogether owing to the death of the proprietors. And in a great number of instances, the tradesmen who remained sent away their families, so that in less than 6 days from the commencement of the outbreak, the most afflicted streets were deserted more than 3/4 of their inhabitants. Now let's take a look at this case. So the outbreak started on the evening of August 31, 1854. John Snow basically investigated some previous epidemics. So he suspected that the water from a community pump well at Broad and Cambridge Street was contaminated. Testing the water from the well on the evening of September 3, he basically saw no suspicious impurities, and so he hesitated to come to a conclusion at the time. So this absence of evidence, however, was not evidence of absence. this is what he said about this particular situation. He says that further inquiry showed me that there was no other circumstances or agent common to the circumscribed locality in which this sudden increase of chloride occurred. And not extending beyond it, except the water of the above mentioned pump. I found, moreover, the water varied during the next 2 days in the amount of organic impurity visible to the naked eye on close inspection in the form of a small white fluid and bottle. So from the General Register Office, the SNO obtained a list of 83 deaths from chloride. When he plotted on the map, these data showed a close link between the chloride and the broad street pump. Then persistent house by house, case by case detective work yield quite detailed evidence about a possible cause-effect relationship, as the SNO made a kind of a street correlation. And he ended up saying this about his work. He said that on proceeding to the spot, I found that nearly all the deaths had taken place within a short distance of the pump. There was only 10 deaths in house situated decidedly nearer to another street pump. In 5 of these cases, the families of the deceased person informed me that they always sent to the pump in Broad Street as they preferred the water taste. In 3 other cases, the deceased were children who went to school near the pump in Broad Street. 2 of them were known to drink the water, and the parents of the third think it's probable that it did so. And the other 2 deaths beyond the district, which this pump supplies, represent only the amount of mortality from chloride that was occurred before the eruption took place. With regards to the deaths occurring in the locality belonging to the pump, there were 61 instances in which I was informed that the deceased person used to drink the pump water from the Broad Street, either constantly or occasionally. In 6 instances, I could denote information owing to the death or departure, to the death or departure of everyone connected with the deceased individual. And in 6 cases, I was informed that the deceased person did not drink the pump water before their illnesses. So there's a reason why I'm going to the big details of this, because there is a side of a statistical analysis that we didn't go through and we are not going to go through, because it's not an easy thing to do. And that side is about the outliers. We never talk about what to do with them, or how to investigate it. A part of his work in proving that a pump is the real reason is working those outliers, whatever that didn't fit. And we're going to go through the details of that in a second. But switch your mind on the idea of what he's working with and what he's explaining is about the outlier in its data that didn't fit his theory originally, and how it basically fitted those later on with further investigation. Okay, so the theory implicating the particular pump was confirmed by the observed covariations. In this area of London, there were few occurrences of chloride exceeding the normal low level, except among those people who drank water from the Broad Street pump. There were a couple of other cases as well, but not as bad as this one. So it was, he decided that it was now time to act, and after all, the reason we seek causal explanation is in order to intervene, to govern the case, the cause, so as to govern the effect. So Snow described his findings to the authorities responsible for the community water supply. The Board of Guardians of St. James Parish on the evening of September 7, 1854, basically received him. The board ordered the pump handle on the brothers to be removed immediately, and the epidemic soon ended. There is a debate on between epidemiologists about if this is the actual cause of ending this pandemic or not. Okay, we're going to go through that in a second. But let's see how he proved his theory beyond the doubt. So, first of all, the results of this intervention, before and after experiment observed, was consistent with the idea that cholera was transmitted by impure water. Snow's explanation replaced previously held beliefs that the cholera spread through the air or by some other means. In those times, in 18th centuries, many years before the discovery of bacteria, one fantastic theory speculated that cholera vaporously rose out of the burying ground of plague victims from 2 centuries earlier. In 1886, the discovery of the bacterium called Vibrio cholera confirmed the Snow story. He is still celebrated for establishing the mode of cholera transmission and consequently the method of prevention, which is keep drinking water, food, and hands clear of infected sewage. Today, at the old side of the Broader Pump, which is here, there is a stand, there is some sort of a public house or a bar named after John Snow, and it has its picture on top, as you can see. And in there, you can basically presumably drink more safely than 140 years ago. But anyway, the question is, why was the centuries-old mystery of cholera finally solved? And most importantly, Snow actually had a good idea, a causal theory about how the disease spread. And that basically guided the gathering and assessment of evidence. And this theory basically developed from medical analysis and empirical observation. Now, by mapping earlier epidemics, Snow detected the link between different water supplies and varying rates of cholera. And by the 1854 epidemic, then the intellectual framework was in place, and the problem of how cholera spread was ripe for a solution. But along with a good idea and a tiny problem, there was also a very good method. And that's what we want to talk about. The Snow scientific detective work exhibits shrewd intelligence about evidence, a clear logic of this data display, and analysis. So, speaking of his logic, he basically considered 4 logics about the way that he went through it. And we're going to go through it one by one. But the first step in his logic was that placing the data in an appropriate context for assessing cause and effect. We're going to see these in the final slide on this case. So the original data basically listed the victims' names and described their circumstances, all in order by the date and by the date of the death. So there were a stack of death certificates, which naturally lends itself to some sort of time series display, as you see here. And this is just how usually in the pandemic people basically plot things. So the thing is that descriptive narration is not causal explanation. The passage of time is a poor explanatory, so it's going to be a poor explanatory variable, particularly useless in describing a strategy of how to intervene and stop the pandemic, the epidemic. There is one other thing about this, and again, we're gonna talk about time series a little bit on this slide, but another thing about this is, which is very valid point, is when your data has more than one dimension, which is the case in here. So everybody else who was an expert in the epidemic at the time would have looked at the time series, how things are progressing over time, regardless of how the time points are. Either they are in years or they're in months or days or hours, right? So that's how they look at it. So they come up with a design. I should not move too much because they might not hear me. So they would come with designs like this. Except that that design doesn't show anything, doesn't prove anything. Why? Because the data actually has another dimension, and that dimension is a spatial dimension of this data. Where this thing is happening. Where this thing is happening is the answer to why it is happening in some way. But if you combine the why, if you combine the spatial resolution of this data with the temporal resolution of the data, which nobody did, but we will get to the conclusion later on about if removing the handle was really the solution. If you combine it correctly, the geographical, the population, the spatial resolution, and the temporal resolution of the data, if you combine everything together, then you get to a very different conclusion of that. And that conclusion is by the time that he removed the handle, there weren't that many people left that the disease could have spread. And if you look at the graph over time, at that point, it was substantially reduced the number of cases that were happening. So it's as if you get to it at the very end of the disease time span. Make sense? He has still found some very interesting things. He gave us some very, very interesting perspectives on how to talk about the data. But the lesson to learn from this is before you start playing around with some data, make sure you understand the dimensions of your data. Data is never two-dimensional. So there's never a single graph that would be able to represent a good data set. Unless your data set only has 4 values, then this is the data. But joking aside, always look at your data before you jump into creating visualization means to give you a conclusion. The data always have multiple dimensions, and those dimensions can carry very informative information inside them that can help you get to a better conclusion. Make sense? Okay. Let's continue with his rules and his logic. So, instead of plotting a time series, which would simply report each day's values, Snow came up with a graphical display that provided direct and powerful testimony about the possible cause-effect relationship. Recasting the original data from their one-dimensional temporal ordering into two-dimensional spatial comparison, Snow marked deaths from cholera on his map, along with locations of the areas of 13 community water pump wells, pump wells, and if you zoom into this map, there would be a character D somewhere that shows the location of the actual this notorious map, this notorious pump that caused the problem. So this map basically reveals a very strong association between cholera and proximity to the Broad Street pump in a context of simultaneous comparison with other local water sources and the surrounding neighborhood without runoff. So we were talking about the logic, and the second point in the SNOWS logic is making quantitative comparison. So the deep fundamental question in a statistical analysis is going to be compared with what? And that's very important when you are creating a graphical visualization. You need to be able to answer that question based on that graphical display. So investigating the experiences of the victims of Corona is only part of the search for credible evidence. To understand fully the cause of the epidemic also requires an analysis of those who escaped the disease. With great clarity, the map presented several intriguing clues for comparison between the living and the dead. Clues strikingly visible at a brewery and a workhouse that were tinted with a different color in the original map. We don't have the original map in here, and we're going to get to that in terms of how ridiculously big this map was. After the original thing, nobody could actually print the original one anymore. And everybody has screwed up when they decided to recreate it. We're going to get to that later. But let's get to the brewery and the workhouse. So this is what he says. The SNOWS says in his report. He says that there is a brewery in the Broad Street near to the pond, and on perceiving that no brewers men were registered as having died of cholera, I called on Mr. Huggins, the proprietor. He informed me that there were about 70 workmen employed in the brewery, and none of them had suffered from cholera, at least in severe form. Only two have been indisposed, and that no seriously at the time the disease prevailed. The men are allowed a certain quantity of malt liquor, and Mr. Hagen believes they do not drink water at all, and he's quite certain that the workmen never obtained water from the pump in the street. There is a deep well in the brewery, in addition to the New River water. So, kind of a save by the beer, right? So, then the other case was at a nearby workhouse. The circumstances of known victims of the epidemic basically provided some sort of important and credible evidence about the cause of the disease, as well as quantitative calculation of an expected rate of cholera compared with the actual observed rate. So again, this is what he says in his report. SNOWS says that the workhouse in the Portland Street is more than three-fourths surrounded by houses in which deaths from the cholera occurred. Yet out of 535 inmates, only 5 died of cholera. The other deaths which took place being those of persons admitted after they were attacked. The workhouse has a pump well on the premises, in addition to the supply of the Grand Junction water works, and the inmates never sent to Broad Street for water. If the mortality in the workhouse had been equal to that in the street immediately surrounding it, on 3 sides, upwards of 100% would have died. So, one important thing. Let's get back one slide. If we were to assess the situation on the basis of time series, which was the norm on looking at this data, we would have missed these outliers. There are 2 obvious outliers in here that are surrounded by areas that are heavily impacted by the cholera here, and there is no cholera in them. In one of them, there is a population of 500, over 500 people there, and there is only 5 cases. In the other one, there is 80 something people there, and 2 people got mildly sick. And this is extremely unusual, given that every other place in there is like a death trap. People are dying daily, and yet in these 2 places, nobody is dying at all for weeks. So, if we were to look at these type of visualizations, we would have never ever captured these 2 outliers. So, without capturing these 2 outliers, he wouldn't have any proof on explaining the outliers. Why the outliers exist? They exist because they are not really outliers. It's just the cause and effect didn't happen there. There were no cause, so there wouldn't be any effect. They are outside the normal of the data completely. Does that make sense? So this is the point that I made earlier about the importance of investigating your outlier. Okay, there are 2 other cases that he is going to investigate about 2 or 3 cases that happen completely outside the main cluster of corora. And he needed to be able to explain why they're happening. If the pump in here is the reason, and if these people are not coming there at all, then why are they getting cholera? And we know the cholera, and he's suggesting the cholera is only transmitting through water and food, not through air. And if that's true, then why did these people who never came to that stream actually got it and died? So that's another side of this we're going to get to in a second, and you will understand how he investigated those. But for now, such clear lucid reasoning may seem commonsensical, obvious and insufficiently technical. Yet we are going to soon see a tragic instance. The decision to launch the space shuttle, when this straightforward logic of statistical and visual comparison was basically abandoned by many engineers, managers, and some government officials, and they ended up killing some astronauts who shouldn't have been flying in that day. Now, let's get a quick look at this part of this map that Snow created. So we were talking about the logic, and the first and the second point in the Snow logic being placing the data in an appropriate context for assessing cause and effect, and the second one was making quantitative comparisons. So now the third of Snow's logic is considering alternative explanations and contrary cases. Sometimes it can be difficult for researchers who both report and advocate their findings to face off to the threats to their conclusions, such as some sort of alternative explanations and contrary cases. So regardless, the credibility of the report is going to be enhanced by a careful assessment of all the relevant evidence, not just the evidence overly consistent with the explanations and the conclusions that we want to make, and those that would basically advance your hypothesis. So the point is to get it right, not to bleed the case, not to sweep under the rug all the assorted puzzles and inconsistencies that frequently occur in collections of the data. So both the Snow's map and the time series of that show several apparently contradictory instances. The number of deaths from cholera with no obvious link to the broader street pump. He said that in some of the instances where the deaths are scattered a little further from the rest of the map, a little further from the rest of the map, the malady was probably contracted a nearer point to the pond. A cabinet maker who reside on North Street, some distance from Broad Street, worked in the Broad Street. A little girl who died in Hamyard, another who died in Anglecourt, went to the school that was in the Broad Street, and they were in the habit of drinking from the pond. So, in a particularly unfortunate episode, one London resident made a special effort to obtain Broad Street well water, a delicacy of taste with a side effect that unwittingly cost 2 lives. A snow report is one of the careful description and precise logic. That is what he said about this particular case. He says that Dr. Fraser also first called my attention to the following circumstances, which are perhaps the most conclusive of all in proving the connection between the Broad Street pond and the outbreak of cholera. In the weekly return of births and deaths of September 9th, the following date is recorded. At West End on 2nd of September, the widow of a percussion cap maker, age 59 years, diarrhea 2 hours, cholera epidemic 16 hours. I was informed by this lady's son that she had not been in neighborhood of Broad Street for many months. The cart went from Broad Street to West End every day, and it was the custom to take out a large bottle of water from the pump in the Broad Street, as she preferred it. The water was taken on Thursday, 31st of August, and she drank of it in the evening, and also on Friday. She was seized with the cholera on the evening of the later day and died on Saturday. A niece who was on a visit to this lady also drank of the water. She returned to her residence in a high and healthy part of the city and was attacked with cholera and died also. There was no cholera at the time, either at the West End or in the neighborhood where the niece died. So that's another very interesting look at some positive outliers that he had. His outliers was those 2 places that was supposed to have a high mortality rate but had nothing, and those couple of places that had a mortality, but they were nowhere close to the causality of this, and he needed to be able to explain those. So, although at first glance these deaths appear unrelated to the Broad Street pond, they are, upon examination, strong evidence pointing to that well. There is here a clarity and undeniability to the link between the cholera and the Broad Street pond. Only such a link can basically account for what would otherwise be a mystery. This seemingly random and unusual occurrence of cholera was really a mystery, and he was able to solve it. And the other very interesting about what he said is the fact that he clearly mentioned that, what was his name? Dr. Fraser. He actually fully credited the idea to Dr. Fraser, who actually found this crucial case that would help him to prove his approach and prove his argument. Remember, at the time, everybody was thinking that the reason that the cholera epidemic happens is transmission through air. He was the only one who was talking about transmission through water and through food. So it was very difficult to prove it, and he correctly basically gave credit when the credit was due. And this is something lots of people in academia and science don't do. So it's noticeable. How much time do we have?
Just shy of 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
I think it's like
Okay. You're not gonna be able to finish this. Okay. Didn't finish this section, the next 4 slides. How far did we come? We come to first two, because you're the last one. Okay, so let's try and cover another 2 or 3 slides, and then we call it a day. And we're gonna come back on Monday to finish the second case. So, ironically, the most famous aspect of the Snow's work is also the most uncertain part of this evidence. It's not at all clear that the removal of the handle from the pump had much to do with ending the pandemic. As you can see in this time series, the pandemic was, the epidemic was already in rapid decline by the time the handle was actually removed. Yet, in many retelling of this story, the pump handle removal is basically considered as a decisive event. The unmistakable symbol of Snow's contribution. There are so many historical passages about this. I'm not going to go through those. So at a minimum, removing the pump handle prevented reoccurrence of cholera. So we can say that there's no recognized several difficulties in evaluating the effects of his intervention. Since most people living in central London had fled, the disease ran out of possible victims, which happened simultaneously with shutting down the infected water supply. The case against the Brotherson pump, however, was based on a diversity of additional evidence. The Coro mapped the studies of unusual instances, comparison of the living and the dead with their consumption of well water, and an idea about a mechanism of contamination, which was based on a nearby underground sewer that had probably leaked into the infected well. I'm not going to go through that one. There were also that idea there. So there were also the finding that coral was carried by water, a life-saving scientific discovery that showed how to intervene and prevent the spread of cholera in future, derived not only from the study of the Boston epidemic, but also from the Snow's mappings of several other cholera outbreaks in relation to the purity of community water supplies. Now, the 4 points in the Dr. Snow's logic is that assessment of possible errors in the numbers reported in the graphics. So Snow's analysis attends to the source and consequences of errors in gathering the data. In particular, the credibility of the cholera map grows out of supplemental details in the text as image word and the number combined to present the evidence and make the arguments. His detailed comments about the possible errors annotated both the map and the table, reassuring readers about the care and integrity of the statistical detective work that produced the data graphic. So he drew a dot map, making each individual dead. This design has a statistical cost and benefits. The death rates are not shown in here, and such maps may become cluttered with extensive details. On the other hand, the sometimes deceptive effects of aggregation are going to be avoided in that way. And of course, dot maps aid in the identification and analysis of individual cases, evidence essential to Snow's argument at the time. So the big problem is that dot maps fail to take into account the number of people living in an area and at risk to get a disease. So an area of the map may be free of cases merely because it's not populated. The SNOWS map does not fully answer the question of compared with what. For example, if the population as a whole in central London had been distributed just as the deaths were, then the Cora map would have merely repeated the unimportant fact that more people live near the Broad Street the Broad Street pond than every other place. This was not the case at the time, and the entire area shown on the map, with or without Cora, was basically thickly populated. So still, a SNOWS dot map does not assess varying densities of population in the area around the pond. Ideally, the Cora data should be displayed on both a dot and a rate map, with population-based rates calculated for rather small and homogeneous graphic units. In the text of his reports, however, Snow did present rates for a few different areas surrounding the pond. Aggregations by area can sometimes mask and even distort the true story of the Cora. For two of the three examples at right that are constructed by Mark Monmoniker from a Snow's individual level data, the instance cluster around the Broad Street pond entirely vanishes in the process of geographically aggregating the data. The greater the number of Cora deaths, the darker the area. In describing the discovery of how Cora is transmitted, various histories of medicine, historians of medicine basically discuss the famous map and the snow analysis. The Cora map, as the way that the snow draw it, is difficult to reproduce on a single page. The full size of the original is awkward, something like a square 40 centimeter or 16 inch on the side. And if reduced in size, then the Cora symbols become murky, and the type is going to become too small. Some editions of this, basically on some famous journals, have just given up, and they just reprinted Snow's text and not the crucial visual evidence of the map because they couldn't recreate it. Redrawing of the map for textbooks in medicine and in geography fail because they cannot reproduce the key elements of the Snow's origin. The Workhouse and the Bury, who were the essential compared with both cases, are usually left unlabeled and unidentified, showing up only some sort of mysterious Cora-free zones that are located very close to the infected well. So the standards of the quality may slip when it comes to visual displays, imprecise and undocumented work that would be unacceptable for boards or tables of data that are going to be too often shown up in graphics. So since it is all evidence, regardless of the method of the presentation, the highest standards of statistical integrity and statistical thinking should apply to every data representation, including the visual displays. Aggregations over time may also mask relevant detail and generate misleading signals, similar to the problems of spatial aggregation in the tree coral maps. So what we got at the top is the familiar daily time series of the deaths from the coral, with a smooth decline in death unchanged by the removal of the pump handle. And when the daily data are added up into some sort of weekly intervals, however, a different picture is going to come out, and the removal had the apparent consequence of reducing the weekly death toll from 458 to 112. But these results come purely from the aggregation. For since the daily data show basically no such effect. Conventionally, the handle was removed in early morning of September 8th. So the plausible weekly intervals of September 1 to 7 and 8 to 14 and so on are basically used in here. And imagine if you had read the story of Jon Snow as reported in the first few pages here. And if our account showed the weekly instead of the daily deaths, then it would all appear perfectly convincing, although quite misleading. Now, this type of trickery with the data is not just happening at that time. You can see example of these in modern days, in these days, with pandemic data. Depending on which broadcasting network you're watching, you're going to see a slightly different pictures of how the pandemic is growing and where it is going. You hear that some of these governments who are in favor or against locking people down would come up with different graphics that would basically support their argument. Okay, so again, we are not going to go on the moral of this, but remember one thing, and that thing is think about the dimensionality of your data. Okay? Think about the aspects that it represents. Some of these aspects are basically hidden within the data. You don't really know them unless you start looking into data very deeply. Okay? A dot map was a good choice at the time for this particular problem. But if he would have overlaid that with the population, and if the population was following the actual death map, then he would have get a very different response and a very different causality. The other thing is he completely ignored the time dimension in here. If he would have incorporated the time correctly, then what he could have had was a special temporal representation, a special temporal geographical representation in some sense. And from there, he could have realized that yes, the problem is the water, but no, the epidemic is also over. Does that make sense? Yes? Good. Now, if he would have overlaid the death map with the information about the jobs of people who were there, he could have get a different dimension here, right? Who is more prone to this particular epidemic? Who is more viable against it? Does that make sense? Yes? So there is an example, I'm not going to go through too much details of it, but from an application that I had to work on many years ago. Assume that there is a company that have data from cleaning the, what are these places that they call in the street? Capture all the waters, this soon, what is it? Hmm? You've seen all of these large areas that they pick it up and clean it up and put it back. I forgot what the heck it was. But so they've got multiple years, let's say 20 years of data from an area that their company was cleaning. And the question was, what can you do with the data? With the data itself, the only thing they could do, how much time do you have? Are you over?
One.
Okay, the only thing they could do at the time was they could train a neural network to tell them when they have to go and clean one of these locations. If they could do that, they could have been very efficient and reduce their costs rather than just sending people to clean the stuff that don't need to be cleaned, right? Now, if they would have overlaid the information that they've got about the locations and the condition of these points across the city with the jobs around the city, with the traffic lights around the city, with the placement of the trees around the cities, then they could have get a ground truth about how the city evolved. And putting a data science happening here, then having that ground truth, then you can control how the city grows. Meaning that, for example, if that city wanted to be part of coalition of the cities who are gonna, for example, observe Olympics, they could easily manipulate the data to see what would happen if the population is increased 10 times, or what would happen if a particular store with that many traffic would basically be added to a particular side of the city. Does that make sense? So overlaying information on top of each other, as well as the term that their dimensionalities support each other, is a very, very good thing in data analysis, and it's a very, very important thing in data visualization. Okay? All right. So we're going to come back on Monday to finish this, and then we take it from there. Thank you, everyone.